Are you looking for ways to build wealth? Then you've come to the right place. I'm Julian McClurkin, the Chief Storyteller with Tribevest. In this 9-part masterclass, I sit down with Jim Pfeiffer, the founder of Left Field Investors. We talk about building wealth through passive investing in real estate. And here's chapter 3. Welcome back to the Masterclass. It's time for chapter 3 with passive syndications, pros and cons. So far, syndications sound pretty cool, but I'm sure there's some downsides. What are some of those?
Yeah, so I think the major downside to syndications is you're giving up control and they're very illiquid, right? So when you buy into one of these deals, it's going to be 3 years at a minimum probably, and could be 5 or 10 years before you can get your capital back. So you don't have a lot of liquidity. There's no secondary market to sell these. So that can be a downside.
What is liquidity?
Liquidity is having cash, right? Cash is liquid, but if you go buy a house, it's not liquid because if you need money, you got to sell the house and that takes time.
Okay, so
liquidity,
it's access to your cash.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
That's a great way to put it. So you lose liquidity with these, which is a definite downside. You also don't have control over the asset. But I would say if you're investing in the stock market, you also don't have control, but you do have liquidity. And that, not to turn all of the downsides into upsides, but not having liquidity sometimes can be a good thing. Last year when we had the pandemic and the stock market dropped 30%, if you sold at the low and stayed out, the liquidity hurt you, right? But in the real estate market, I wasn't selling, I just held because I had to, and everything came back. And so you don't end up having the panic selling as much. So that it is a downside to have that illiquidity, and you need to know that going in before you invest in one, but it can also save you. So you should never invest in a syndication money that you think you're going to need in the next 5 years or something.
Yeah, sometimes it's good not to have access to too much money because the more access you have to it, the more you'll spend.
Exactly, that's exactly right.
Is that the only downside, the liquidity?
Another downside is the minimums, right? The minimum investment is $25,000 or it could be up to $100,000. So to get into, we talked about, and we'll talk more about diversifying. If you need $25,000 to get into a deal, how many deals can the regular person get into in a year? So that's a real challenge. And that's where Tribevest has a great solution, right? Tribevest, as we talked about before, allows groups to pool their money together. So you can get into, if you have $25,000 to invest, you could get it, if you have a group of 5, now you can get into 5 deals instead of just one. So again, it is a downside that the investment minimums are so high, but you can get around that by group investing. So we talked a little bit about K1s. Those are a tax document this is getting in the weeds a little bit, but I think it's important. The LLC does not pay taxes. It's a pass-through entity. So it passes through its tax burden to all of the LPs, all of the owners. And they do that through a K1. And the K1 is the document you get. It's like a 1099 that people get for their stock market. But the K1 will list losses, gains. It just lists a bunch of stuff that your accountant will look at and put in a bucket, and then that tax comes directly to you. So the problem is those aren't filed usually until March 15th, March 31st, something like that. So if you're going to file your taxes on time on April 15th, you have to know that your K1s are coming in on time so you can do your own tax return. So every investment you do in a syndication is going to send you a different K1. So now you are adding up some accounting costs. If you have an accountant, every K1 they're going to charge you for, and it complicates things. But for me, I'll take that complication and that little extra work that my accountant might have to do for the benefits of syndication investing, which we've talked about. So a couple other minor downsides or obstacles maybe is you have to do the deal, you're going to have to wire $25,000, $50,000, $100,000 to someone you probably haven't met. You've had a few conversations with them, so you really need to vet the sponsor and become comfortable enough to be able to send that money out. Another thing is the PPM we talked about, right? Private placement memorandum. Could be 100 pages, 200 pages. Dealing with those documents is frustrating. It's time consuming to dig through them. So it's just an added layer of friction, right? But all of those things I think you get around when you start getting to the upsides, which hopefully we'll talk about next.
Yeah, definitely want to get into the upsides, and I'm hoping there are some after all those downsides.
Absolutely. One of the biggest upsides is the tax, right? If you're investing or anytime you're making money, the biggest, not risk factor, but the biggest factor working against you is taxes. And you can reduce, defer, even eliminate almost all of the tax when you invest in real estate. because the tax code is written to part of it is written to benefit real estate investors, right? So there's depreciation, which means the useful life of something is less and less as it gets older. So you can use that depreciation to offset almost all of your passive gains. So if you're doing it right, when you're investing in a syndication, you will not pay tax on any of the cash flows you receive. It will be deferred probably, and you have to recapture later, and we'll talk about that, but it's your tax bill is going to go way down the more syndications you invest in.
But your accountant needs to know about all of the benefits.
Yes, it's very important that you have an accountant that understands real estate, and preferably someone who invests in real estate themselves, because there's depreciation, and there's something called bonus depreciation, which means instead of depreciating part of the building every year, you can depreciate it all up front. So companies do what's called a cost segregation. Again, fancy term, you get engineers in the building and they run their numbers and they figure out what can depreciate when. And so if you can get, let's say you invest $50,000 in a syndication. I've had syndications come back with the K1, which says what the taxes are, that I have a $55,000 loss in the first year. So I've already received some income from this property, but for tax purposes, I have a $55,000 loss. I can use that to offset income from that syndication. Also, I can use that to offset income from any real estate transaction that I have. So if you keep this bucket of losses, anytime you win, you just eat away at it. And then there is depreciation recapture at the end. And this is where when you sell the building, remember all that bonus depreciation I talked about that you took as a loss? Now you have to recapture it. And so that's where you would be taxed. However, you just made some money, right? Because you sold the investment. Now if you take that same money and go invest it in a new deal.
1031 exchange?
Not a 1031 exchange. My accountant calls it a lazy 1031. So a 1031 exchange is where you can defer tax by buying a similar property, right? The lazy 1031 is instead of buying a similar property, you just buy another syndication. You get another round of bonus depreciation to offset the recapture you just had. I know this is getting complicated, but basically somebody in my network calls it the golden hamster wheel, right? You get on this thing, you have this depreciation. When you sell, you recapture it, but then you go buy a new asset and you get the bonus depreciation again that cancels out that recapture, and you just keep going.
It kind of sounds like the Burr method of tax.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. It's like, as long as you keep going,
it's a rinse and repeat.
Right. You can defer most of your tax, and so you'll make this money and you won't be taxed on it. And so even if you're getting a better return in the stock market, which personally I don't think you do, you have to pay tax on it. There's no way to defer that tax. This tax you can push off, and the longer you push off the tax, the better it is for you in your financial situation.
Oh man, that's huge. Yeah, that's huge. You gotta pay taxes immediately with gains in the stock market. Like there is no rollover or 1031 exchange for stock, or a lazy 1031 with stock market gains.
Exactly.
That's so true.
And taxes are the biggest obstacle to creating wealth, and real estate removes that obstacle.
Well, this is sounding great so far. What are the other benefits?
So we talked about it a little bit already, but diversification, right? I think that's a great benefit that people don't think of when you're thinking of real estate, because they think, I can only afford this one property. But again, if you use things like Tribevest or a way to get into multiple syndications, then you do have that diversification. And the group investing is another advantage. You can't really group invest in the stock market, right? But group investing, what it does, it not only reduces the minimums, but also gives you confidence. Right? When I found out somebody else in my network was investing in the same deal as I was, I thought, oh man, this is a smart guy. So now I have somebody else who's doing the same thing. And that community of group investing really just kind of solidifies a lot of what you're doing, because you understand other people are doing it too.
Are there any other benefits?
Yeah, there's a bunch, and we're not going to go through them all, but another one is the management of the asset, right? You don't have to manage it. You do a lot of upfront work, and then you give your money to somebody else, and they manage the asset and just return money to you. So I think that's a great advantage. There's also different investing strategies. Just like in the stock market, if you want to buy foreign index funds and U.S. funds, there's all kinds of different options. And it's the same way. There's a bunch of different asset classes, and if you really want to get into it, you can invest overseas as well. So there's a lot of ways to diversify and distribute your investments. A couple other things I'd like to mention is one is community. Again, either through Tribevest, Left Field Investors, or whatever community you're in, just working with other people and creating a group so you can talk and understand. And that's how much you just accelerate your learning process. You can get into so many different things. There's also one thing that I really like. One of the biggest advantages, other than tax advantages, it's velocity of money.
What do you mean by velocity of money?
So you don't want your money just sitting still, right? So you want to keep it moving into multiple assets. So an example, let's say you invest your $25,000 in a real estate syndication, and that syndicator goes and they try to force the equity to grow, right? So they force appreciation. And they do that by rehabbing the apartments. They might do dog fences around lower level apartments and charge an extra $50 a month. And the thing is, when you charge an extra $50 a month rent, it seems like a small thing. Or when you spend $5,000 rehabbing an apartment and you only raise the rent $100, I mean, do the math. It takes forever to pay that off, but you're thinking of it wrong. What that does is that $100 increase in rent is $1,200 a year. And if you do that on 100 apartments, now you've increased the income of that property, which then increases the value of the property, right? So you do a little thing that increases the value because you're using leverage multiple times. So what ends up happening, the velocity of money, is you do all these improvements, or the operator does, right? You're an LP, so you just sit back, you're not doing anything. But the GP does, they improve the property, then they go to the bank and they say, hey, you know that building that was worth $20 million? It's now worth $30 million. I'd like a new loan. And the bank says, okay. And they give you the loan, right? Now, what does the operator do with all that cash? They send it back to you. So now, let's say they did it so you're 25 grand invested. In 2 years, they give you your $25,000 back. You still own that asset. You're still getting cash flow from that asset, but you have your capital back, and you go put it in a new deal.
Wow.
Now, you have $25,000 that you invested. Now you own 2 cash flowing properties, and it just snowballs. So velocity of money is putting your money into action and not letting it just sit there. But as soon as you get the initial investment back, you go do another one, and now you have 2 sets of returns.
Man, that would be a dream investment, to invest $25,000 and then get it back in a couple of years and continue to get a paycheck from that initial investment. That would be amazing. I'd give you 50 the next time.
All right, give it to me.
Oh, the way my account's set up. That does it for chapter 3. You know it comes after 3, right?